Okay, so to begin with, you should already have a photo reference, and it's not actually a photograph you're looking at. It's more likely going to be a master painting done by a pro. And I've selected those guys specifically because they have a wide range in terms of gradient and color. So you're going to first of all begin by taping your paper down either vertically or horizontally to your board. You want to make sure that you tape it down on all four sides. I tried to make sure that the blue tape is overlapping halfway onto the paper, halfway onto the board, and I tried to apply it evenly. I do think that it would be a good idea to outline in pencil the shapes that you're seeing there, especially if you have clouds, so cloud masses, or if you have other things that you'd like to include. You can simplify the scene. So if there's an object in there that's kind of in the way, like a tree or a boat, you can take that out and focus primarily on the sky if you want, or you can try and replicate exactly the image as you see it. When painting a sky, it's important that you always start up at the top and work your way down. So we're working at the very top part of the sky, and usually the top part of the sky is the darkest part. And then it slowly progresses and gets lighter as it goes down towards the horizon. So I'm looking at my reference, I'm gauging if that's true of my reference, which One it thing is. that You can is see my important reference when you're painting taped clouds to the board is there. to actually paint around them. So a lot of artists will paint a sky and then they'll try and put clouds on top, but I think it works better if you paint around the clouds. So I call them like sky holes or cloud holes, and you just leave like a blank area where the clouds are going to be. The reason why is because you can get brighter, more accurate clouds if you paint around them and you leave the paper blank where the clouds are going to go. So it requires a little bit of planning ahead of time. But this is especially true if your clouds have a lot of color or if they're very pale or fluffy white. You'd want to leave the white of the paper exposed so that way you can get those bright, vivid colors. If you try and paint over a blue, you'll see through the coat below to the blue and it's not as brilliant, whereas if you leave a gap, it will be bright. So on my sky, you can tell it's a sunset. There's some orange kind of mixing into the blue. So that's what I'm doing there. I'm starting off with kind of a blue, but it's not a pure blue. That's the thing. You always have to color match. It's a blue mixed with a little bit of the crimson color and some yellow to it. So essentially the three primary colors plus white. But it always depends on the ratio of one paint to another. So if you get that ratio off, instead of being blue, it could look kind of green. And if you wanted to adjust that, you'd have to put in more blue and possibly more red or crimson. When you're doing this, it's important to think about that tick mark exercise. You want to paint with short strokes. I personally like to paint using a vertical or erratic stroke, which means I'll do a short stroke and then I'll try going at crazy angles so that I can actually point with my brush stroke towards the focal point. So I'll steer the viewer's eye to the focal point, like pointing it down towards the horizon because that's where the focal is. And I'll use my brushwork to guide the eye. Some artists do paint side to side horizontally, but that's really not my preferred method. I think I can get a better blend if I either go angled or erratic or doing an kind of an X pattern. I'd use a lot of X strokes where I do kind of like a vertical X. Getting the right values is important here too. You can see I'm transitioning to more of that orangey color, so it's still got some blues and greens in it, but it's the sky color that I mixed previously, plus I've mixed in like a kind of an orange with a little bit of white to it. And as it goes towards that horizon, it just turns more and more golden. So I'm adding more of that kind of peach color or orange plus white to it and a little bit of sky color left in, so there's a little bit of a green hue as well. You always have to ask yourself, what is the value? What is the temperature? So value means how dark or how light a hue is. Temperature means how warm, how cool. Is it leaning towards the oranges, reds, red violets? Is it leaning towards the cools, which is the greens, the blues, the blue violets? Now I'm going to go into those cloud gaps, those holes for the clouds, and I'm going to start filling them in. And again, you have to ask yourself, like, are the clouds darker than the sky? Are they lighter? Because it will depend on the lighting scenario. For my reference photo, the clouds are a degree darker than the sky, and they have kind of a purpley cast to them overall, although the glow from the sun is changing those purple clouds into kind of a tangerine color and then like some red violet there too. When you're doing the clouds, it's important that you use kind of a curvy stroke and you try and make those clouds look fluffy. Part of that is making the edge a soft or blurred edge. So I like to use what's called a dry brush for that, which means I don't have hardly any or no water on my brush when I do it. And I take the purple color, the cloud color, and I push that into the sky color and I overlap it. So it's partially overlap, it's partially keeping short strokes. You also have to tell yourself that when you're painting clouds, you're really painting a form. So a form is like a sphere or a cylinder. Most clouds tend to be kind of sphere shaped, kind of like an oval sphere. That's what we're kind of trying to relay here. And if you know it's going to be sphere shaped, you can actually wrap your stroke around the form. This is particularly true of cumulus clouds. Those are the fluffy big cotton ball clouds. Remember how I told you that skies are about doing gradients and looking for gradients. There are always going to be gradients in the sky, but not just in the sky itself, but also in the clouds too. So there's a gradient here within these clouds, and it's going from purple at the top, and then it's going to that crimson color, and then to the orange. One thing about gradients is you want the transition between one hue to the next to be a smooth transition. If it's looking too much like stripes, think about how you can overlap or get a little bit stronger with your color mixing, create like an in-between value so it can kind of bridge that gap. If you have a sky that includes big temperature changes, like in this sky it's very cool and blue at the top and then it transitions to that yellow orange, then you may need to use multiple brushes. I used 4 brushes here and I rinsed them off. Like the glow of that sun needs to be pure, and if you have blue or violet on there, it won't be pure anymore. It's going to be shifted to a different hue and it'll be probably a muted, subdued color. So you just need to remember either to wash your brushes or use all your brushes when you're doing this. I'm using mostly a medium brush, not a super tiny brush, but a medium brush for a lot of the sky. And then you can include some of the background. I always think it's a good idea to ground a sky so it's not just sky alone. So I'm including some of the background that is in the photo reference that I'm looking at. Things that are in the background tend to take on a blue hue, and that's because there's a lot of sky particles between the eye and the object, and the farther away off in the distance the object is, like this mountain or plateau, the more sky particles there are between the eye. So it turns blue. And then you always want to ask yourself, what's darker, the ground plane or the mountain? And then you might have to adjust. So this is something that requires 2 coats of paint. You can probably get 1 coat of paint on in 1 class period. You might be able to start to layer a 2nd coat on top. I do like to let my acrylic paint dry before I go in for a 2nd coat, but I always see a 2nd coat as an opportunity to correct things, to work on my gradients, to work on my transitions, to get the clouds to look fluffier, to adjust things that were not perfect in the beginning. Here's what the painting looks like with nearly 2 coats of paint on it everywhere. Now there are still areas that need adjustment, so I would go back and continue to add layers on there. So this is something you're going to do as well, and skies are really fun. Enjoy them. Try doing a vertical or an X mark or erratic stroke, not necessarily a horizontal, although you could. I would also check out the direction of the stroke that the artist was using, because you're mostly looking at paintings. One thing I'll tell you is if you really don't like any of the skies I have selected. You could look through your own photo library and find one that you would like to paint. It has to have a healthy gradient in it though, so a transition from dark to mid-tone to lights at the horizon.